All right, so now that we have some materials, some lights, what we can talk about is render quality. So when we talk about render quality, we're not talking about how good the thing looks in terms of artistic appeal. We're talking about its literal quality in terms of what's going on with the pixels and what's going on with the graininess here. So you can see you have those two sort of areas there. Now, when it comes to rendering, we're going to deal with two main properties that are going to control this. The number one property is going to be resolution. So when it comes to resolution, that is the size, right? And we've explored this a bit with previous rendering. You'll see that it's 960 by 540 by default. Generally speaking, we're going to want to have this around 1080 to get a good idea of what kind of quality we're going to have for something like film. But if we're doing a still rendering, if we're not doing an animation, we could actually go larger than this. We could also go 4K, but I don't suggest it. You'll be rendering for a while. So that's going to be one of the big ones, is resolution. The next thing is going to be something called samples. And samples is going to be the internal quality that reduces things like grain. So resolution is going to give us more pixels to work with, but samples are going to determine how we affect those pixels. So let's go ahead and start out with resolution. We can adjust that up here using the render settings. I'm going to do a quick store snapshot here. I'm going to do a view store snapshot. That way we can see the difference. We can go ahead and click our render settings. And in the comment tab, if we scroll down here, we can go from HD 540 to HD 1080. Now, one of the things I want you to notice down here is the render time. You'll notice with the 1080, it's actually taking a lot longer for this to render to completion, and you can see the iterative squares as they appear. So it looks like it completed here, and it took about 9 seconds to render. If we take a look at the original here, you can see it took about 2 seconds. Now, I'll do a quick store snapshot on this, and if we go ahead and take a look at these full screen, you can notice a little bit of a difference between the two, especially if we zoom in here. You can see this is the 540 details, this is the 1080 detail. So you can see there is a massive difference already in terms of the quality of the object and the quality of something like the shadow, but notice we have all this grain in here still. So how do we start to remove some of this graininess from this scene? Well, one of the number one ways is going to be using something called light samples. So let's go ahead and start with the main offender, which is generally going to be our global lights. So global lights are any lights that affect the entire scene. In this particular instance, the skylight is going to be our number one offender in this particular scene. So when it comes to that sky dome light, we can go ahead and pull this up in the attribute editor here. And if you come into the render settings here, you'll be able to access the sample section, and these samples are going to be what controls this quality. Now, the next question is, how high do we go? There's some generic rules for this. You could really crank this up as high as you want, but when it comes to rendering, it's going to give us diminishing returns. So you have to be aware that this render time is going to go up. Now, when you're dealing with a global light like this, global is generally going to require you to have somewhere between 6 to 8 samples here. And this is going to be the highest that you're generally going to go with a light. So in this particular instance, we could start with something like 6, and we can see how much grain that removes. I'll just go ahead and type 6 into samples and hit enter, and then this will start rendering again. Now these renders are going to take increasingly longer, so just be aware of that. And this is where we're going to start to earn that time. You'll see right now it's at 30%. We're already at 11 seconds. So previously we were at 9 for a single render. You can see how substantially different this is, and it's increasing. All right. So just be aware our render times are going to start to skyrocket as we work our way up here. If I zoom in here, though, you'll see that there is a bit less grain if I compare to the original to this one. However, it came at a hefty cost. This one only took 9 seconds to render. This one took 29 seconds. We added 20 seconds to our render. Pretty drastic. All right, so let's go ahead and store that as a snapshot. We do have another light in here, which is the directional light. And the directional light's a bit different because it's a Maya light. So you might notice, where are the samples here? Well, you can find it pretty easily. When it comes to Maya lights, there's a special Arnold section, which is going to deal with all things pertaining to Arnold. There's some pretty cool settings in these that we'll explore later on, but just to stick to the basics, samples is located here. Now, for non-global lights, which is anything that doesn't affect the whole scene, we're generally going to do somewhere between 2 to 4 with the sample settings. In this particular instance, I'll set it to about 4 on the higher end, since it's our only other light source. Now, once again, this is going to take a while to render. You can see how the unrendered regions have this sort of graininess, and then as they finish, they reveal the nice finished areas. How much is this going to increase it? Not by as much as the global light. The global light affects everything, therefore it takes the longest to render. But area light, directional light, it affects quite a few things, but it's probably not going to add as much time to a render, maybe not any. As a matter of fact, this actually rendered faster, which is a bit confusing. But if we zoom in here now, we can compare, and you'll see there was really a negligible difference there in terms of quality. There's really no difference, I would say. So we probably didn't even need to up the samples there, but hey, we did anyway. Okay, we didn't finish the grain. Okay, well, what can we do from here? Samples for lights are going to make some of the biggest difference, as you can see from this jump to this jump, right? There's a big difference there, especially if you're looking in the shadow between here and there. But when it comes to these surface forms here, we need to go into the render settings to smooth these out. So if you come into the render settings here, we can pull this up, and we can gain access to a section here called Arnold Render, the second section here. And inside of here, we're going to have access to samples. So this section here, the sampling section, is the master section for controlling the quality of our image. Going through these, the camera anti-aliasing is the overall anti-aliasing performed across the entire image. This is going to be the most important in terms of increasing quality, but it has a drawback where this is also the biggest boost when it comes to time. So you just have to be aware that increasing this comes with a massive cost. Now, when doing a fast render, so to speak, that you want to have good quality, but it's not going to take you your whole life, you can set this to around 6, and that's going to be an okay setting. But when you're doing a final beauty render and you don't mind sitting it out, you should set this to 10. And something to be aware of is 10 is going to be the max for these. If you go beyond 10, you'll get into issues. It will let you do that. But 10 is essentially the cap. Now, I'm not going to adjust this one first. I usually adjust this one last because it's kind of the icing on the cake. And my general rule is I always set this to 10 if I'm doing something like a portfolio piece or a final render. So I'm going to do that one last. You'll see underneath this, we have some specific categories. We have diffuse, specular, transmission, SSS, which stands for subsurface scattering, and then volume indirect. So some of these names might sound familiar to you. These are pertaining to the shaders. So when we talk about diffuse is going to deal with the base hit and the outward sort of projection of light. So you can think of it as our color. That's going to affect areas like the ground heavily, and it's going to affect areas like the plastic. Specular, on the other hand, is going to be the reflectivity. It's going to be the actual shine. It's going to affect areas like the highlight, and it's going to affect areas like the metals. So those are going to be the main ones we care about. Transmission deals with transparent objects. We have none, so we don't need to adjust this. One of the really cool things about Arnold render settings is it doesn't make you adjust things you don't have. Same with subsurface scattering and volume indirect. We don't need any of those. What's cool, though, is if we do have those, we can up those. Now, how do we start this process? Well, generally, the process is to double it. So we'll go from 2 to 4, and we'll see what the result's like. Now, be very diligent in doing your store snapshots. You can also sample a region, which is useful to talk about at this point. If we're not in a snapshot, you can utilize this icon here to render a region. So let's say I'm trying to work out just the diffuse. I might target an area like the ground, which I know is a Lambert, it has no specularity, and just highlight this with a little square here. And now when it renders, it's only going to render this square. So I'm using this icon here to do a regional render. You'll see if I turn that off, it does the whole thing. But if I crop it, it'll just render that one area. And this is a way we can kind of fastly do this rather than taking 30 seconds every time. So with that said, if I go ahead and do a quick store snapshot, we can store these. You'll see it's just this region rendered. And then I can up diffuse to something like 4, and we can see how that affected grain. And if I go ahead and compare, zoom in here, You can see it actually removed it quite a bit, but maybe not enough. So I could set this up to something like 6. And you'll see now at 6, almost all of the grain is gone. I think we could call that good. But if I was greedy, I might up that all the way to 8. But you'll see between 8 and 6, not that big of a difference. So you have to kind of pick your poison and decide, where is a big enough jump. So this one's currently at 6. Let me store that as a snapshot. Let me set this down to 4, and we can compare 4 to 6 and decide if that's a good enough jump. And I'd say, yeah, between 4 to 6 there is, but between 6 to 8 there isn't. So I'll set that to 6. It may differ for your scene depending on your setup. So if I go ahead and let this render now, it's going to take a while because these samples are being applied. But let's go ahead and sample a specular area. Let's go with the shiny area here on the metals and maybe the plastic. So I can go ahead and sample across here. And if we take a look at this, you can see the metal is still very grainy. So this is where I'm going to need to sample specularity. I'm going to do a view store snapshot to store this. Then in the specular, I can up this to 4 and we can compare. And you can see that cleaned up a lot. That's going to be at 2. That's going to be at 4. Let me store that. And let's go ahead and try this at 6 and see if there's a good enough jump to justify it. So this is 6. This is 4. And I'd say if I was going for a really polished look, that's probably enough of a jump to justify it. So 6 and 6 would be what I would want there for now. Okay, so that's going to be a pretty drastic leap. If I go ahead and unclick my region here and let this render, it's going to take a moment to render, but we'll be able to see our effects applied in full. You'll notice that it's really chugging at this point. So yeah, I gotta let this go. I'm gonna do a jump forward in time for you, and we'll see how long it takes for this to complete rendering, and we can compare it to where we started. All right, so coming back, it looks like it finished up here, and you'll see it is at 58 seconds. So it's just under a minute here to render this out. But this is the result we're getting now. You can see how smooth and beautiful things are looking compared to where we began. If I go ahead and compare this, let's see. There we go. So you can see how grainy this was and how clean it is now. This was at a 9-second render. This is now at a 58-second render. So pretty impressive. Now, let's go ahead and do the big one, anti-aliasing. I'm not going to set this up a substantial amount. I'm going to set it to 6 and once again, jump forward in time for you. But we'll go ahead and try 6 camera, 6 diffuse, and 6 in the specular for this first go. The anti-aliasing affects everything, so it's literally just a quality dial. Like I mentioned, if you're trying to do a shot for something like a portfolio and it's a single frame render, just crank this to 10 and walk away for however long it's going to take. Sometimes it takes days, so just be aware of that. But this would be the icing on the cake. So I'm going to hit this to 6, hit enter. We're going to let that render out. You'll see it's starting the rendering process. And then we'll just take a look at the 2 when we get back, when I jump forward in time for you. All right, so this one took a while to render. You can see this was 3 minutes and 34 seconds. Was it worth it? That is the question of the day. So if we go and compare these guys now, if I zoom in here, you can see how clean and crisp this looks compared to this. Now, if we zoom in real close, you can see some differences there. You can see that this was with the anti-aliasing applied. This is without. So that last bit of graininess, you can see is kind of removed. It's relieved out of there, and we get a very clean end result. And you can imagine if we push that to 10, we'd get an even cleaner result. Okay. So now we have a pretty clean looking image, but at the cost of a 3-minute render time. That is long, especially if we're doing iterative testing. So what can we do from here? Well, we can kind of keep a note of this, and we can set this to have okay render settings for our needs. So what does that mean? That means basically down resing. So we're going to talk about that, but before we do, what I want to emphasize here is that is how you adjust the quality of your render. So first is going to be light samples. Second is going to be through your render settings, okay, and the samples there. Now, something to be aware of is this is a pretty bare bones scene. We have 3 materials. We have the plastic, we have the metal, and the Lambert. That's all we have going on. We have 0 texture maps, and we only have 2 lights. This render time would be substantially higher if we had texture maps, multiple maps, more materials. So just be mindful that this is going to be a compounding thing. The more we add, the longer it takes. So when you're working, so to speak, and you're not doing the final render, what you want to do is you want to tone these back to something that gives you an okay result, but gives you fast render times. So I'm going to save this as a store snapshot, and I'm going to backtrack my camera anti-aliasing to 3. I'm going to take my diffuse down to 4 and my specular down to 4. This is a very common setup I like to use with Arnold, a 3-4-4 setup. And if I had things like transmission and subsurface, I might consider bumping those to 4 too. When it comes to the lighting, I'm going to bump down the skydome light to 4, and I'm going to bump the directional light down to 2. So basically cutting those values in half. And that's going to give me better render times for faster results, essentially. Now, what I also do is I don't render at 1080. That's the final thing I do. What I like to work at is HD 720. So I'm going to come into my common settings here, set that to HD 720, hit the exit button, and render. Okay, so that will be sort of my preview render setup, but I wanted to take you through those various things so while we move forward, we can adjust these as needed. Because when we're judging whether or not a material is working, whether it's looking good, we want to make sure it's not a render quality issue and it's actually a texture map issue. And having just a basic setup like this, it looks good enough. Most of the grain's gone, and you can see it was a 12-second render. This looks much better, right? The HD version, but we'll take a 12-second render over that. And that's what we'll use to set things up. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is try bumping up your render settings a bit. You don't have to go crazy with it like I did. I mainly did that to show you how long things would take. But bump them up to at least what I have here to our setup with 4 diffuse, 4 specular, and then when your lighting set up for your global light, try that at a setting of 4, and with any other lights you have, try those at a setting of 2.